Wealth has bought you a seat here, but it hasn't bought you character. Those devastating words from a restaurant server would destroy a billionaire's empire and launch a political career that proves intelligence is the ultimate equalizer. When Danielle Rhodes delivered the most epic verbal takedown ever captured on camera, nobody knew they were witnessing the birth of America's next political powerhouse. What drives a decorated federal judge to publicly humiliate a hedge fund CEO? How does a simple napkin thrown in cruelty become evidence in congressional testimony that reshapes labor law? Watch as viral videos expose the shocking moment when systematic workplace abuse meets brilliant retaliation, proving that some battles are won not through violence, but through the kind of intellectual warfare that leaves opponents speechless. This is the story of how one woman's refusal to accept degradation transformed her from invisible service worker to the voice of a generation. Stay until the end to see justice served with the precision only true brilliance can deliver.
Do you speak proper English or just TikTok slang? Those 12 words, dripping with racial prejudice and class contempt, would echo through Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant before a brilliant waitress delivered a verbal takedown so devastating it would humble a billionaire and launch a career that would reshape American politics forever. Le Bernardin's private dining room buzzed with the quiet energy that comes when New York's elite gather to discuss deals worth more than most people's lifetime earnings. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in Italian linen, while the soft clink of premium silverware provided a soundtrack to conversations about market acquisitions and political influence. This wasn't just dinner. This was where power brokers came to reshape the world over $30 appetizers and wine that cost more per bottle than minimum wage workers earned in a month. Sterling Voss burst through the mahogany doors at 8:47 p.m. His presence immediately disrupted the refined atmosphere like a hurricane hitting a garden party. At 52, he carried himself with the particular brand of arrogance that comes from inheriting wealth and mistaking luck for intelligence, his perfectly tailored Armani suit unable to disguise the toxic energy that followed him like expensive cologne mixed with entitlement. "Finally!" he barked at no one in particular, his voice cutting through conversations at nearby tables as he surveyed the room like a conquering general reviewing his territory. "Where's my table? I don't have time for amateur hour tonight." Danielle Rhodes approached with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to navigate hostile environments while maintaining her dignity. Her movements elegant, despite the standard black uniform that marked her as service staff in a world designed to make such distinctions matter. At 28, she possessed the kind of natural beauty that transcended circumstances. Intelligent dark eyes, perfect posture, and a smile that suggested depths most people never bothered to explore. "Good evening, Mr. Voss," she said, her voice carrying the warm professionalism that came from genuine education rather than corporate training scripts. "I'm Danielle, and I'll be taking care of your table tonight. Welcome to—" "Finally, some help!" Sterling interrupted with theatrical exasperation, his pale blue eyes scanning her face with the dismissive evaluation of someone appraising livestock. "Do you speak proper English or just TikTok slang? Because I need someone who can actually understand complex requests tonight." The silence that followed was deafening. A middle-aged couple at the adjacent table stopped mid-conversation. Their forks paused halfway to their mouths as they processed what they had just witnessed. The woman's eyes widened with the particular horror that comes from watching someone commit social suicide in public, while her husband shifted uncomfortably, suddenly fascinated by his wine glass. Danielle's response was a masterclass in controlled composure. Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained steady, professional, untouchable. "Of course, sir. I'd be happy to assist you with anything you need this evening." But something flickered in her eyes, not defeat or embarrassment, but the quiet calculation of someone who had just been handed ammunition she would use when the moment was right. Sterling Voss had no idea that he had just insulted someone whose intelligence, education, and connections would soon make his corporate empire look like a child's lemonade stand. What none of them knew, what none of them could have guessed from her service uniform and gracious demeanor, was that they were witnessing the opening moments of a confrontation that would expose the ugly truth about American class dynamics while launching the political career of someone destined to become a voice for everyone who had ever been dismissed because of how they looked or where they worked. If you've ever been underestimated because of your job, your age, or your appearance, hit that like button right now. Share your own story of being judged too quickly in the comments below and subscribe to this channel, because what happens next will prove that sometimes the most powerful responses come from the people others assume have no power at all.
Right at that moment, as Danielle's composed response hung in the air like a challenge wrapped in professionalism, Sterling Voss should have recognized the dangerous calm in her demeanor. But arrogance has a way of making powerful people blind to the very signs that should warn them they're about to face consequences. And what followed would prove that systematic cruelty often reveals more about the aggressor than the target. The evening became a masterclass in psychological warfare disguised as fine dining. Sterling treated every interaction with Danielle as an opportunity to establish dominance, his voice carrying across the intimate dining room with the peculiar volume that wealthy people use when they want everyone to witness their sense of superiority. "This wine isn't civilized enough," he announced after barely tasting the $150 bottle of Bordeaux that Danielle had recommended. "Bring me something that wasn't chosen by someone who probably drinks box wine at home." The insult was calculated and specific, designed not just to reject her suggestion, but to diminish her worth as a human being in front of the other diners. Danielle simply nodded, replaced the bottle with his preferred selection, and continued serving with the kind of grace that made Sterling's cruelty appear even more grotesque by comparison. But Sterling wasn't finished establishing his perceived hierarchy. "You know what bothers me about this generation?" he said loudly, clearly performing for the room rather than having a conversation. "No one smiles like they're grateful anymore. Smile like you're lucky to have a job, sweetheart. It's called customer service." The command was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had never learned the difference between respect and fear, between authority and abuse. Danielle's smile became a work of art, perfectly professional on the surface while somehow conveying that she understood exactly what kind of man she was dealing with. The situation escalated when Sterling's son, Preston, arrived, a 25-year-old who had inherited his father's sense of entitlement without developing any of the business acumen that had originally built their fortune. His first interaction with Danielle set the tone for the kind of evening this would become. "Girl, where's my water?" he snapped, not bothering to look up from his phone as he slumped into his chair. "And don't bring that filtered nonsense. I want Pellegrino and I want it now." The casual use of "girl" to address a grown woman was deliberate, designed to reduce her to the status of domestic help rather than acknowledging her as a professional providing a service. It was the linguistic equivalent of a slap, meant to remind her of her place in their perceived social hierarchy. "This people don't usually work here, do they? I mean, this is usually a more traditional establishment." The phrase "you people" carried centuries of coded language, transforming what should have been a simple dining experience into something far more sinister. But Danielle continued serving, her professionalism becoming a form of resistance that somehow made their cruelty look smaller and more desperate. In the kitchen, Sylvia Martinez, her Latina co-worker, watched through the service window with growing concern. "Danielle, you need to say something," she whispered urgently. They're treating you like garbage." Danielle's response was quiet but carried the weight of someone who had learned to choose her battles strategically. "Not yet," she said, her voice calm but her eyes holding something that suggested the evening was far from over. "But when I do, they'll never forget it." What Sterling and Preston didn't realize was that they weren't just abusing a waitress, they were systematically humiliating someone whose intelligence, education, and connections would soon make their displays of wealth look pathetic by comparison.
No one expected what lay hidden behind Danielle's composed exterior, because sometimes the most powerful people in any room are the ones who've learned to disguise their brilliance behind circumstances that others use to dismiss them. What happened during her brief respite in the staff break room would reveal the extraordinary mind that Sterling Voss had been too blind to recognize. The employee break room of Les Bernardines existed in stark contrast to the opulent dining areas, fluorescent lighting, plastic chairs, and the lingering aroma of industrial cleaning supplies mixed with leftover food. But for Danielle, this humble space had become her sanctuary, a place where she could drop the mask of professional servitude and reconnect with her true purpose. She pulled out her tablet with the reverent care of someone handling sacred text, her fingers moving across the screen to reveal pages of dense academic writing titled "Systemic Bias in American Hospitality: How Class and Race Intersect to Perpetuate Economic Inequality." This wasn't casual reading. This was her master's thesis in public policy from Columbia University, a document that would soon influence federal legislation on worker protection and discrimination in the service industry. "Damn, girl," Sylvia said, peering over her shoulder with genuine admiration. "You're going to be president one day. I'm serious. You've got that Obama energy, but with better hair." Danielle's laugh was soft, but carried undertones of ambition that most people never got to hear. Maybe not president, but definitely someone who changes how people like Sterling Voss treat people like us. The conversation was interrupted by Marcus, another server whose 10 years in high-end Manhattan restaurants had taught him the unspoken rules of survival in spaces designed to favor wealth over humanity. "Danielle, be careful with that table," he warned, his voice tight with genuine concern. "Sterling Voss owns half this block. Cross him and you'll be blacklisted from every decent restaurant in the city. I've seen it happen." But what Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Danielle's history with Sterling Voss ran deeper than tonight's casual cruelty. 2 years earlier, fresh from her undergraduate studies at Harvard with a double major in economics and political science, she had applied for an internship at Voss Capital Management. Her application had been pristine: perfect grades, stellar recommendations, innovative research on economic inequality that had been published in academic journals. The rejection had come without explanation, without interview, without even the courtesy of personalized feedback. Just a form letter thanking her for her interest and informing her that they had selected candidates who were a better fit for our corporate culture. She had suspected then what she now knew with certainty, that her name, her background, her very existence had been deemed incompatible with their vision of success. "He doesn't own my voice," Danielle said quietly, her words carrying the weight of someone who had learned that true power comes not from controlling others, but from refusing to be controlled. Her fingers moved across her tablet screen, scrolling through research that had taken her to congressional hearings, policy think tanks, and the offices of civil rights organizations that most people only read about in newspapers. What Sterling Voss didn't realize as he continued his performance of superiority in the dining room was that he wasn't just abusing a waitress. He was systematically humiliating someone whose intellectual capacity, professional connections, and moral authority would soon expose him as the small, petty man he had always been beneath his expensive suits and inherited wealth. The break was over, but the real confrontation was just beginning.
But the tragedy had not stopped yet.
Because sometimes when powerful people mistake silence for weakness, they push their cruelty to levels that transform private humiliation into public spectacle. And what Sterling Voss did next would cross every line of human decency, while giving Danielle exactly the platform she needed to destroy him. The evening reached its breaking point during what should have been a routine wine service. Danielle approached the table carrying a bottle of the Chateau Margaux that Sterling had specifically requested. Her movements graceful despite the toxic atmosphere that had been building throughout the dinner. As she began to pour, Sterling's voice cut through the restaurant's ambient noise with the force of a verbal assault. "This wine is from Bordeaux, not Burgundy, like you claimed earlier," Danielle said quietly, offering the gentle correction that any sommelier would appreciate. Her tone was respectful, informative, the kind of professional guidance that distinguish quality establishments from tourist traps. Sterling's reaction was explosive and immediate. His fist slammed against the table with such force that crystal glasses jumped and wine sloshed across the pristine white tablecloth, creating dark stains that looked like spilled blood under the chandelier's warm light. "You don't correct me!" he roared, his voice rising to a level that made conversations throughout the restaurant cease as diners turned to witness the spectacle. "You pour and you smile and you keep your mouth shut about things you couldn't possibly understand." The silence that followed was crushing in its weight. Danielle stood perfectly still, the wine bottle still in her hands, her composure intact even as Sterling's spittle landed on her cheek. But something had shifted in her expression, not fear or submission, but the cold calculation of someone who had just been handed the perfect ammunition for a war she had been preparing to fight her entire life. "If I ran this place," Sterling continued, his volume designed to ensure that everyone in the restaurant could hear his performance of dominance, "she'd be gone before dessert. This is exactly what's wrong with hiring people who don't understand their place in the world." Preston, emboldened by his father's display and eager to prove his own capacity for cruelty, threw his cloth napkin at Danielle with the casual violence of someone who had never faced consequences for his actions. "Maybe try Applebee's next time, girl. This might be a little too sophisticated for your skill set." The napkin hit Danielle's shoulder and fell to the floor, a gesture so deliberately humiliating that several diners gasped audibly. An elderly woman at a nearby table covered her mouth in horror, while her husband reached for his phone, clearly debating whether to intervene or simply document what was happening. Mr. Callahan, the restaurant manager, materialized with the nervous energy of someone whose career depended on keeping wealthy customers happy, regardless of their behavior. Instead of addressing Sterling's conduct, he approached Danielle with apologetic gestures that made his priorities crystal clear. "Mr. Voss, I'm so terribly sorry about this misunderstanding," Callahan stammered, his voice carrying the obsequious tone of someone who had learned to grovel professionally. "Please allow me to personally handle your service for the remainder of the evening."
The betrayal was complete. Danielle looked at her manager, a man who had praised her customer service skills just days earlier, and watched him choose Sterling's money over her dignity without a moment's hesitation. The message was clear. In this world, wealth trumped humanity, and her years of professional excellence meant nothing when measured against Sterling's ability to influence the restaurant's bottom line. That's when Danielle Rhodes made a decision that would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone who had ever been dismissed, degraded, or dehumanized by people who confused bank accounts with character. She set the wine bottle down with deliberate care, smoothed her uniform with the precision of someone preparing for battle, and turned to walk away from the table. But she wasn't retreating. She was preparing to deliver a lesson in dignity that would humble a billionaire and launch a career that would reshape American discourse about power, respect, and the dangerous assumption that money can buy the right to treat other human beings as disposable. If you've ever watched someone abuse their power while others stood by in silence, if you believe that wealth should never be an excuse for cruelty, hit that like button right now. Share your thoughts on how we can build a world where respect is based on character rather than bank accounts. And subscribe to this channel, because what happens next will prove that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room belongs to the person everyone assumed had no power at all.
Right at that moment, as Danielle turned to walk away from Sterling's table, something extraordinary happened that would transform a moment of private humiliation into a public reckoning that would echo across social media and boardrooms from Manhattan to Silicon Valley. What she did next would prove that sometimes the most devastating responses come not from anger, but from the kind of controlled brilliance that can only be unleashed by someone who has been systematically underestimated their entire life. Danielle didn't storm out of the dining room or retreat to the kitchen to cry in private. Instead, she moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had just realized that the universe had handed her the perfect stage for a performance that would define not just her career, but her legacy. She walked to the center of the dining room, positioned herself where every table could see her clearly, and transformed from service worker into something far more powerful, a truth teller with nothing left to lose. The restaurant fell silent as she cleared her throat, her voice carrying with the kind of natural authority that comes from years of academic training and intellectual preparation. When she spoke, it wasn't to Sterling's table alone, but to the entire room of witnesses who had watched his performance of cruelty without intervention. "Mr. Voss," she began, her voice steady and clear as crystal, cutting through the ambient noise of a restaurant where conversations had stopped and all attention focused on the woman in the server's uniform who was about to redefine everything everyone thought they understood about power dynamics. "Wealth has bought you a seat at this table tonight, but it hasn't bought you character. You speak of class while demonstrating none. You demand respect while showing no understanding of what the word actually means." The words landed like precision strikes, each syllable carefully chosen for maximum impact. Sterling's face went pale, then red, as he realized that the woman he had been tormenting was not only fighting back, but doing so with an eloquence and intelligence that made his crude displays of dominance look pathetic by comparison. But Danielle was just getting started. She had spent years studying rhetoric, public speaking, and the art of intellectual warfare. This wasn't an emotional outburst. This was a master class in how to dismantle someone's sense of superiority using nothing but truth, intelligence, and the kind of moral authority that can't be purchased with inherited wealth. She continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You've spent this evening treating me as if my worth as a human being is determined by the uniform I wear and the job I perform. But your behavior tonight has revealed something profound about the difference between having money and having value. You mistake volume for authority, cruelty for strength, and entitlement for achievement." Gasps echoed throughout the dining room as other patrons realized they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just a server standing up to an abusive customer, but a brilliant mind systematically destroying the philosophical foundation of aristocratic arrogance. Preston, sensing that his father's dominance was crumbling and desperate to reassert some control over the situation, started to rise from his chair with the intention of shouting down this uppity waitress who had forgotten her place. But Danielle turned her attention to him with the kind of withering focus that stopped him mid-motion. "And you," she said, her gaze fixing on Preston with laser-like intensity, "you'll inherit his fortune, but you'll never earn his respect. More importantly, you'll still never learn how to earn anyone else's. Money can buy you access to places like this, but it can't buy you the character necessary to deserve that access." The words hit Preston like physical blows,
each observation cutting deeper than any insult because they contained the uncomfortable ring of absolute truth. Here was someone half his age wearing a uniform that marked her as his social inferior, delivering insights about character and worth that revealed how intellectually and morally bankrupt his entire worldview actually was. The entire restaurant was transfixed now, phones discreetly appearing as diners realized they were witnessing something that would be shared across social media platforms within hours. This wasn't just dinner theater. This was a cultural moment, a crystallization of class conflict and racial dynamics that would resonate far beyond the walls of this exclusive Manhattan establishment. Sterling finally found his voice, sputtering with the incoherent rage of someone whose sense of superiority had just been systematically demolished by someone he had dismissed as intellectually inferior. "How dare you speak to me like that? Do you have any idea who I am? Do you understand what I could do to your pathetic little career?" But Danielle's smile suggested that Sterling had just asked exactly the wrong questions to exactly the wrong person. Her response would not only answer his threats, but reveal the depth of his miscalculation in choosing her as a target for his cruelty. "Mr. Voss," she said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had been waiting years for exactly this moment. "I know exactly who you are. The question you should be asking is whether you have any idea who I am, and more importantly, who's been watching you tonight." What happened next would prove that sometimes the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone assumes has no power at all.
No one expected what happened next, because sometimes the universe orchestrates moments of perfect justice where power reveals itself in the most unexpected forms. And what emerged from the corner table would completely rewrite the dynamics of everything Sterling Voss thought he understood about influence, connections, and the dangerous game of underestimating people based on their appearance. As Sterling rose from his chair, his face purple with rage and his mouth opening to deliver what he clearly intended to be the final crushing blow to this uppity waitress who had dared to challenge his authority, a voice cut through the tension with the kind of quiet power that makes entire rooms freeze in recognition of true authority. "I've heard quite enough." The words came from a distinguished black man in his 60s who had been dining quietly at a corner table, observing the entire spectacle with the patient attention of someone accustomed to watching human nature reveal itself in its rawest forms. Judge Harold Wilkins rose from his seat with the deliberate dignity that comes from 30 years on the federal bench, his presence immediately transforming the atmosphere from confrontational to reverential. Sterling's mouth snapped shut as he recognized one of the most respected jurists in American legal history, a man whose opinions had shaped civil rights law and whose influence extended far beyond any courtroom. But what Sterling didn't understand, what he couldn't have known, was that Judge Wilkins wasn't just another powerful man who happened to be dining at Le Bernardin that evening. "I came here tonight," Judge Wilkins continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades making decisions that affected millions of lives, to celebrate with a young woman whose intellect and character have impressed everyone she's encountered in academic and policy circles. I didn't expect to witness a public display of the very prejudices her research seeks to address." The revelation hit Sterling like a physical blow. This wasn't a random encounter between an abusive customer and an unfortunate waitress. This was a carefully orchestrated moment where his true character was being evaluated by someone whose opinion could influence everything from federal judicial appointments to corporate board positions. Danielle's smile was subtle but devastating as she watched Sterling's world begin to crumble. "Judge Wilkins," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of genuine affection mixed with professional respect, "thank you for coming tonight. I know how busy your schedule is." The relationship between them was immediately clear to everyone watching. This wasn't mentor and student, but respected colleagues who moved in circles that Sterling's money couldn't access.
Judge Wilkins had been following Danielle's academic career since her undergraduate thesis on economic inequality had been cited in federal court decisions, and he had personally recommended her for the prestigious national fellowship that would launch her into the highest levels of American policymaking.
"Ms. Rhodes," Judge Wilkins replied, his formal address making it clear that he saw Danielle as a peer rather than a subordinate, "has been selected for the Marshall Fellowship, one of the most competitive public service programs in the country. Her research on systemic bias in service industries has already influenced 3 pieces of federal legislation, and she's been asked to testify before Congress next month about workplace discrimination." The silence that followed was crushing in its implications. Sterling Voss, the man who had spent the evening treating Danielle like an intellectual inferior, was learning that he had been systematically humiliating someone whose academic credentials, professional connections, and future influence would soon dwarf his own. But Judge Wilkins wasn't finished exposing the depth of Sterling's miscalculation. "What makes tonight particularly unfortunate," he continued, his voice taking on the tone he used when delivering sentences that would reshape lives, "is that Ms. Rhodes has been documenting workplace harassment and discrimination as part of her research. Tonight's behavior will likely become part of a case study that will be read by policymakers, civil rights attorneys, and business leaders across the country." The implication was devastating. Sterling hadn't just abused a waitress, he had provided a real-time demonstration of the very behaviors that were about to be criminalized through federal legislation. His cruelty would become evidence in congressional hearings, academic papers, and legal precedents that would protect future workers from exactly the kind of treatment he considered his right to dispense. Preston, finally understanding that his family's wealth and connections were meaningless in the face of genuine intellectual and moral authority, sank back into his chair with the expression of someone watching their worldview collapse in real time. Sterling, realizing that he wasn't the most powerful person in the room, was written across his face in expressions that cycled through shock, fear, and desperate calculation. The man who had built his identity around dominating others through financial intimidation was discovering that true power, the kind that shapes laws, influences culture, and changes society, belonged to someone he had dismissed as irrelevant. Judge Wilkins approached Danielle with the respect due to a rising star in American public service, his handshake firm and his smile genuine. "Shall we discuss your testimony over dessert?" he asked, his invitation making it clear that the evening's real business was just beginning, while Sterling Voss had just been revealed as an irrelevant sideshow whose cruelty would soon become a cautionary tale told in law schools and policy seminars across the nation. The hunter had become the hunted, and Sterling was about to discover that some battles are lost the moment you choose the wrong opponent.
Right at that moment, as Judge Wilkins and Danielle began discussing her upcoming congressional testimony like colleagues rather than customer and server, Sterling Voss should have recognized that his evening of cruelty was about to become a national cautionary tale. But pride has a way of making powerful people double down on their mistakes. And what happened over the next 24 hours would prove that in the age of social media, no amount of money can control a story once it reaches critical mass. The viral explosion began before Sterling even made it home to his Fifth Avenue penthouse. Multiple diners had discreetly recorded different portions of Danielle's verbal takedown, and within an hour of the confrontation, overlapping videos were spreading across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram with the kind of organic velocity that money can't buy and public relations firms can't stop. The hashtags emerged organically from the collective outrage of viewers who recognized that they were witnessing something profound. Hashtag Danielle Speaks began trending within 2 hours, followed by hashtag Silence the Billionaire and hashtag Grace with Power.
But it was the longer clips, showing Sterling's escalating cruelty, followed by Danielle's composed devastation of his character, that transformed the incident from viral moment to cultural phenomenon. Black Waitress destroys racist billionaire with pure intellect, read one caption that had been shared over 50,000 times. This is what happens when you underestimate the wrong person, declared another that was approaching viral status. The comment sections became battlegrounds of class consciousness, with users sharing their own stories of workplace abuse and celebrating Danielle's refusal to accept degradation silently. By Tuesday morning, Sterling's crisis management team was in full panic mode. Rebecca Martinez, his head of public relations, had been fielding calls since dawn from major news outlets wanting statements about the restaurant incident, while his legal team scrambled to assess potential defamation claims that they all knew would only amplify the story's reach. "Sir, we need to control this narrative immediately," Martinez explained during an emergency board meeting at Voss Capital Management. "The videos are being shared by celebrities, civil rights organizations, and major news personalities. CNN wants a statement, and the New York Times is running a feature about workplace harassment in the service industry using your interaction as a case study." But Sterling's response revealed that he still didn't understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. "Sue them all," he demanded, his voice carrying the same imperious tone that had gotten him into this situation. "Sue the restaurant, sue the girl, sue anyone who recorded without permission. I won't be humiliated by some waitress who doesn't know her place." What Sterling didn't realize was that his threats were being heard by people whose influence extended far beyond his financial empire. Dr. Angela Davis had shared the video with commentary about the intersection of race and class in American service industries. Senator Elizabeth Warren had retweeted the clip with observations about economic inequality and worker dignity. The story had transcended viral entertainment to become a serious discussion about power, privilege, and the treatment of working people in America. The situation escalated when Preston, displaying the same tone-deaf arrogance that ran in his family, decided to threaten Danielle directly through social media. His Instagram story, viewed by his 20,000 followers, declared, "Some people don't understand the consequences of disrespecting their betters. Legal action is being considered against certain individuals who have overstepped their bounds."
The post was screenshot, shared, and dissected by thousands of users who recognized it as an attempt to intimidate someone whose only crime had been refusing to accept abuse silently. But Preston had made a critical error. He had threatened someone under the protection of one of the most respected federal judges in American history. Judge Wilkins' response was swift and devastating. Within hours of Preston's social media threat, the young man received a phone call from the judge's chambers that would reshape his understanding of how power actually works in American society. "Mr. Voss," Judge Wilkins said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades on the federal bench, "I want to make something crystal clear. Ms. Rhodes is under my personal mentorship and professional protection. Any attempt to intimidate, threaten, or harass her will be met with the full force of federal law. I have colleagues in the Justice Department who take a very dim view of wealthy individuals using their resources to silence public servants whose work serves the greater good." The call lasted less than 5 minutes, but its implications were devastating. Preston wasn't just facing potential criminal charges for witness intimidation. He was learning that his family's money was meaningless when confronted with institutional power backed by moral authority. Meanwhile, the public fallout continued to accelerate. Major donors to Sterling's Political Action Committee began withdrawing their support, citing concerns about association with someone whose treatment of service workers had become a national embarrassment. Corporate clients started requesting meetings to reassess their relationship with Voss Capital Management,
using diplomatic language that everyone understood meant they were preparing to take their business elsewhere. The most devastating blow came when Mr. Callahan, the restaurant manager who had chosen Sterling's money over Danielle's dignity, found himself at the center of his own controversy. Videos showing his obsequious response to Sterling's abuse while ignoring Danielle's humiliation had made him a symbol of institutional cowardice. Within 48 hours, he had resigned from Le Bernardin amid calls for boycotts and protests from hospitality workers' unions. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Callahan issued a public apology that revealed how completely the power dynamics had shifted. "I failed in my duty to protect a valued employee, and I apologize to Ms. Rhodes, whose grace under pressure and professional excellence should have been my priority rather than appeasing a customer whose behavior was inexcusable regardless of his financial status." Sterling Voss had spent one evening treating a brilliant woman like disposable help, and in return he had been exposed as exactly the kind of person whose wealth couldn't disguise his fundamental lack of character. The waitress he had dismissed was about to testify before Congress while he was watching his business empire crumble under the weight of his own documented cruelty. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, and America was watching every moment of his fall.
Right at that moment, as Sterling's empire crumbled under the weight of his own documented cruelty, the universe was preparing to deliver the final chapter in a story that would transform a moment of workplace harassment into a launching pad for one of the most inspiring political careers in modern American history. What happened next would prove that sometimes the greatest victories come not from destroying your enemies, but from becoming everything they said you could never be. 6 months after that fateful evening at Le Bernardin, Danielle Rhodes stood at the podium in the Hart Senate Office building, her voice carrying across a packed committee hearing room as she delivered testimony that would reshape federal workplace protection laws. The transformation was stunning. Gone was the server's uniform, replaced by a tailored navy suit that spoke of success without arrogance, her presence commanding the kind of respectful attention that Sterling Voss had spent his entire life trying to purchase. "Senators," she began, her voice steady and authoritative as cameras captured every word for national broadcast. "What you see before you today is not just the recipient of the Marshall Fellowship, but living proof that brilliance exists in every workplace, at every level, wearing every kind of uniform. The question is whether we as a society will create systems that recognize and protect that brilliance, or continue to allow wealth and privilege to determine whose dignity matters." The committee room was filled with civil rights leaders, labor organizers, and policy experts who had come to witness what everyone understood was a pivotal moment in American labor law. But perhaps the most satisfying sight was the empty chair that had been reserved for Sterling Voss, who had been invited to testify about corporate responsibility and had declined, citing scheduling conflicts that everyone understood meant he was too humiliated to face the woman he had tried to destroy. The Marshall Fellowship had just been the beginning of Danielle's meteoric rise. Her research on workplace discrimination had become required reading in law schools across the country. Her policy recommendations had been incorporated into federal legislation, and her name was being mentioned by political insiders as a future candidate for everything from Attorney General to the Supreme Court. But it was the television interviews that truly revealed how completely the power dynamics had shifted. Anderson Cooper had dedicated an entire segment to her story, framing it as a masterclass in how dignity and intelligence could triumph over institutional prejudice. The New York Times had featured her on the cover of their Sunday magazine with the headline, "The Voice They Tried to Silence," accompanied by a photo that showed her in the Capitol building, tablet in hand,
ready to reshape American policy. The most devastating moment for Sterling came when 60 Minutes ran a feature about workplace harassment that used his treatment of Danielle as the central case study. The segment included expert analysis of his behavior, commentary from labor law specialists, and footage of Danielle's congressional testimony that made his cruelty look not just morally reprehensible, but intellectually embarrassing. What we witnessed in that restaurant, explained Dr. Beverly Tatum, a renowned expert on workplace psychology, was a man so blinded by his own prejudices that he systematically humiliated someone whose intellectual capacity and professional accomplishments far exceeded his own. It's a perfect example of how bias can make even wealthy, supposedly sophisticated people look utterly foolish. Sterling's attempt at damage control had only made things worse. His carefully crafted public apology, released through his crisis management team, had been received with such widespread mockery that it became its own viral moment. "I regret any misunderstanding that may have occurred, and I have great respect for all service industry workers who contribute to our economy," the statement read.
The apology was so tone-deaf, so obviously written by lawyers rather than coming from genuine remorse, that it spawned its own hashtag misunderstandingmyass. Social media users dissected every word, pointing out that Sterling still couldn't bring himself to acknowledge that he had been wrong, that his behavior had been cruel, or that Danielle deserved a direct apology rather than corporate spin. Meanwhile, Danielle's response to his hollow gesture had been masterful in its brevity and devastating in its impact. When asked by reporters about Sterling's apology, she had simply said, "Actions reveal character more clearly than words ever could." Mr. Voss showed us who he really is that night, and his response since then has only confirmed it. The contrast between Danielle's grace and Sterling's desperate attempts to salvage his reputation had become a case study in crisis management programs, demonstrating how authenticity and moral authority could triumph over public relations machinery and unlimited financial resources. But perhaps the most powerful moment came during Danielle's final television appearance, before she left for Washington to begin her fellowship. The interviewer had asked her what she would say to young people, particularly young women of color, who felt invisible or undervalued in their workplaces. "I would tell them," Danielle said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had transformed personal pain into public purpose, "that your worth is not determined by how others see you, but by how clearly you see yourself. Every time someone underestimates you, they're giving you information about their limitations, not yours. Use that information wisely." The final shot that would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling showed Danielle walking up the steps of the Capitol building, her heels clicking against the marble with the same rhythm that had carried her through Les Bernardins' dining room months earlier. But now those footsteps echoed with the sound of someone who had transformed a moment of cruelty into a lifetime of purpose. The world had listened, and it would never be the same.
Here's the truth that Danielle Rhodes taught us without ever raising her voice. In a world where people mistake wealth for worth and power for character, the most transformative victories come not from destroying your enemies, but from becoming everything they said you could never be. I've spent years analyzing power dynamics and social movements, and I can tell you that the most lasting change happens when someone refuses to be diminished by circumstances designed to make them invisible. Danielle's story reveals something profound about how we navigate systems built to favor certain people over others. Sterling Voss made the classic mistake of confusing his bank account with his value as a human being,
assuming that money gave him the right to dehumanize someone whose intellectual capacity and moral authority would soon eclipse his own. But Danielle understood something that Sterling never learned. True power isn't about controlling others through fear or intimidation. It's about refusing to let others control you through their limited vision of what you're capable of achieving. The lesson here extends far beyond restaurant confrontations or workplace harassment. Every day, we encounter people who try to define our worth based on our current circumstances rather than our potential, who see uniforms instead of minds, who mistake quiet dignity for weakness. Danielle's response shows us that the most effective way to combat systemic disrespect isn't through anger or retaliation. It's through excellence so undeniable that it forces everyone to confront their own prejudices. What makes her victory so powerful is that she didn't just embarrass Sterling Voss. She transformed his cruelty into fuel for change that will protect countless others. Her congressional testimony didn't just vindicate her personal experience. It created legal frameworks that will prevent future workers from enduring what she endured. This is what authentic leadership looks like, using your pain as a platform to ensure others don't have to experience the same suffering. Sterling's downfall wasn't caused by bad publicity or social media backlash. It was caused by his fundamental inability to recognize excellence when it didn't match his expectations. He saw a black woman in a server's uniform and immediately assumed he knew everything about her capabilities, her education, her connections, and her future. That assumption cost him everything because it blinded him to the reality that he was attacking someone whose trajectory would soon make his achievements look ordinary. The most satisfying aspect of this story isn't watching a billionaire get humbled. It's seeing someone refuse to let other people's limitations become her limitations. Danielle could have accepted that cruelty was just part of the job, that wealthy customers had the right to treat service workers however they wanted, that speaking up would only make things worse. Instead, she chose to believe that her dignity was non-negotiable, and that choice changed not just her life, but American labor law. Judge Wilkins' intervention reminds us that real power often moves quietly, that the most influential people are often the ones who don't need to announce their importance. His presence that night wasn't coincidental. He was there because he recognized Danielle's potential and wanted to support her journey. This is what mentorship looks like when it's done right. Powerful people using their influence to amplify voices that deserve to be heard. If this story reminded you that your current circumstances don't define your future possibilities, if it inspired you to refuse degradation in your own life, hit that like button right now. Share your own story of standing up to workplace bullying or discovering hidden strength in difficult moments. I read every comment, and your experiences inspire the stories I choose to tell. And if you believe that intelligence, character, and dignity are more powerful than money and status, subscribe to this channel for more stories that prove excellence is the best revenge and authenticity is the ultimate power.